Good evening. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is my weekly internet show at a new day of the week and new time, Sunday evenings at 6:30. We're going to give it a try and see how things work out. Nice to be back with you all this week. You probably saw in the news that there's another big bailout in the works now, $126 billion bailout to Spain to cover a huge, dangerous, ominous situation in the banking industry there. This whole thing's fascinating. All these bailouts for the last 5, 6 years. I mean, you know, this could be called the era of the bailout. Well, of course, in foreign affairs, we would call it the era of torture and assassinations. I mean, that's really the era in which, young people have grown up in the last 10 years. The era of torture and assassinations and the era of financial bailouts. I mean, if there's not anything more than that, it tells you the whole defective nature of the system under which we're living. I don't know what does. Now, it's very interesting about this bailout for the banks in Spain. They keep making references that this is a European problem and a European solution, but you know, Europe doesn't have $126 billion. I mean, those people are as broke as you could be, and I mean, sure they got some money, the Germans, for example, but I find it very difficult to believe that the German people who have resisted using their hard-earned money to bail out the people of Greece are all of a sudden going to be forking over willingly and eagerly $126 billion to the bankers in Spain. I mean, my hunch, and I have no evidence of this, but my hunch is the U.S. Federal Reserve is part of this bailout. Now, of course, we won't know that because everything's secret there. This is one of the reasons, in my opinion, they never want to be audited, so that they can take U.S. taxpayer money, transfer it to banks overseas, claim that national security is at stake, and put the American taxpayer on the hook without even going to Congress. Well, just doing this totally secretly. And the reason that I base this on is that many years ago when I was living in Texas, the Mexican banks were having problems. And lo and behold, the Federal Reserve secretly goes in there and uses U.S. taxpayer guarantees and so forth to underwrite these Mexican banks, the Mexican banking system. Same sort of thing. And it was incredible to me that the Federal Reserve has the power to do this without getting the permission of the elected representatives of the people. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. Now, again, I don't have any evidence that they're doing that, but President Obama was putting pressure on European leaders to resolve this Spanish problem before it gets out of hand and so forth. My hunch is that when President Obama is putting pressure on there, that he's also offering some carrots to people over there, some candy. I mean, this is an election year. And if Europe starts having financial problems, that's going to be reflected over here in the United States. And this is election time. My hunch is that there's some Federal Reserve participation in this. Or there's International Monetary Fund, which of course is the nice little secret surreptitious way for the U.S. government to underwrite Europe's financial problems, so that it doesn't look like the U.S. is participating in a direct bailout. They just filter the money, launder it, if you will, through the International Monetary Fund. They give the money to the International Monetary Fund, U.S. taxpayer money, and they act like, oh, we're so benevolent, we're so good. And then the IMF then goes around and transfers the money. It's just a straight welfare program. It's a welfare program for European bankers or European government officials. And so my hunch is that the Fed's behind this thing, or the Treasury Department, or both. But you see, the whole banking system in Spain, it's really reflective of the banking system here. That's what a lot of Americans don't realize, is how similar in principle the European economic system is to the American economic system. And of course, in Europe, you've got, massive government involvement in the banking industry, taking care of people's deposits and so forth. I mean, over here, you've got the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Hey, we're insuring people's deposits. When a bank goes under, nobody loses his money if up to a certain limit. Government comes in, takes over the bank, or causes it to merge with another bank. And so everybody thinks this is all hunky-dory. You've got a bank fail here, a bank failure there. Okay, fine. But what I've been asking at the Future of Freedom Foundation, for almost since the time we got established, is that's all fine and good for, individual banks that go under. But what happens if there's an industry-wide banking collapse? And of course, the answer is very simple. I mean, the only way that they can, pay everybody back their deposits is by taxing everyone, because that's the only way government has any money. It taxes people in order to give welfare to people. So if there's an industry-wide banking collapse and they've got to pay everybody off, where are they going to get the money? The only way they can get the money is by taxing everyone. So they tax everyone $100,000 in order to cover their deposit that's now been lost in this failed banking crisis, $100,000. And that's what is going on in Spain. It's an industry-wide banking collapse. And so all of a sudden they've got this $126 billion coming from who knows where. But notice that nobody wants to talk about the system itself. You see, it's a systemic problem that when government, decade after decade after decade, for example, here in this country, where the government, takes care of failing banks, causes them to merge, has deposit insurance for depositors, what they're really doing is propping up a weak system. I mean, you'd be best off that companies are poorly run, you let them go under, okay? But that's not what's been going on. For decade after decade after decade, they absorb these weak banks, they cause these mergers with the more successful banks, and decade after decade, the system starts to weaken. And you ultimately reach a point where it starts to totter. And that's exactly what's been happening in Spain. And there's people saying, oh, that could not happen in the United States. Nonsense. Of course it can happen in the United States. The Fed has been doing this type of thing, propping up banks for decades. And of course the same thing can happen over here. But you see, it's a systemic problem. Now, what do we libertarians say about this? Well, we say that there should be free banking. Not free in the sense that, hey, you don't have to pay money for your, bank services and so forth. No, free of government control or regulation. I mean, look, when you invest your money in a company in the stock market and that company goes under, is the government there to bail you out? Of course not. But yet, if that had been the system, if, let's say, during the Roosevelt Revolution, it came about that anybody who invests in the stock market is going to be covered by the federal government through federal stock insurance. So if you lose, let's say, up to $100,000, we're going to cover you. Well, obviously, people would have been accustomed to that, but you would end up with a very weak, system of propping up failed companies and so forth. I mean, we've become acclimated to the idea that if you invest in a stock, might go up, might go down. If it goes up, you keep your money. Well, except for, capital gains and so forth, dividend taxes and so forth. But if it goes down, the government's not there to prop you up and bail you out. Well, we libertarians ask, why not the same system for banks? You put your money in a weak bank. Now, obviously, in a free banking system, you've got to do your investigation, just like, you're expected to do in the stock market. And so you investigate which banks are stronger, which ones are weaker. The weaker ones are going to be offering higher rates of interest, bigger risk. And so you put your money, whichever bank you choose. If it goes under, well, then you lose your money, just like you've invested in the wrong stock. But you see, we've all been subjected to this notion that government should take care of us, government should watch over us, and never stopping to think that what they're doing is not only creating a society of weak, dependent child adults that are not going out and doing their own homework and their own investigations and their own determinations as to which companies to invest in or which banks to put their money in. And not only do you get the citizenry that are saying, oh, no, no, the government's taking care of me, the government's taking care of me, but you get a system-wide problem of weak companies or weak banks. And I think this is probably one of the biggest differences between libertarians on the one hand and conservatives and liberals on the other. Now, notice I lump conservatives and liberals into the same category. The reason I do that is because when it comes to freedom, what does it mean to be free? That, in my opinion, it may be very well the biggest difference between libertarians and liberals and conservatives is the concept of freedom. Is that, now in some instances our concepts are the same, are basically the same. Religious liberty, the liberals, conservatives, and libertarians would say, we don't want government involved in the religion business. We don't want you subsidizing churches. If a church starts to go out of business, we don't want you to bail out the church. We don't want you regulating the church. We want free churching, okay? And meaning that we want it free of government control or regulation. And if a church goes under, it goes under. What if people have donated large amounts of money? Well, they just lose it, okay? I mean, that's the system that we have on religion or churching. Keep government out of it, even if people have lost their donations when a church goes under or whatever. Now, same thing on intellectual liberty. By and large, we all share the same concept that government shouldn't tell us what we should read and shouldn't read and so forth. Now, obviously, there's differences in the areas on the border. Pornography and so forth. Libertarians would say, look, legalize it all. Leave this to the conscience of each individual. Liberals would say the same thing. Conservatives would say, no, put people in jail for reading that kind of literature. But by and large, there's a fundamental agreement that, leave people free to read what they want, to write what they want. Freedom of speech. I mean, by and large, there's agreement on freedom of speech. Where the big difference comes in is in the concept of economic liberty. And this, in my opinion, is maybe the biggest difference between liberals and conservatives on one hand and libertarians on the other. We libertarians say, look, freedom involves keeping everything you earn, and you decide what to do with it. Okay, and it involves opening up a business without asking anybody's permission in the government. No licenses, no permits. You want to be a hairdresser? By golly, you do it. Now, you may not get any customers if you're not any good, but nobody's going to be there to bail you out, okay? If the customers don't line up and, you've got a lease agreement with your landlord and you're losing money, you can't run to the government and say, oh, please, please bail me out. No, you're on your own. I mean, this is what we libertarians call freedom, okay? It's a way of life where you can open up businesses. You don't have to ask government's permission to sustain your life through labor. God gave you some talents. Nature vested you with talents and abilities and interests. And you say, hey, I'm going to go to work for somebody or I'm going to start my own business. I don't need a license or a permit. And I'm going to enter into mutually beneficial transactions with people. And I'm going to hopefully make some money. And I get to decide what to do with it. In other words, I can donate it, I can spend it, I can invest it, I can save it, I can hoard it, I can even destroy my own money if I want to. I mean, that's the concept of freedom that distinguishes libertarians on the one hand from liberals and conservatives. Liberals and conservatives hold a totally different perspective on this. What their concept of freedom is the extent to which government takes care of people. Yeah, I mean, it's like if government is taking care of people, people are free. That's their concept. And the idea is that, well, gosh, if government's got a person on a dole, that means the person's got more opportunities. He doesn't have to worry about where his money's coming from, or he can invest in something. He can put his money in the bank, and if it goes under, the government's there to take care of him. When he gets old, the government's there to take care of him. When he gets sick, the government's there to take care of him. If he's not too educated, the government's there to take care of him. The government's there to take care of people. That's their concept of freedom. And it's very interesting because you see, we libertarians, we say Americans under our concept of freedom are in no way free. You can't consider Americans today free. There's just no way. And yet liberals and conservatives would say, nonsense, Jacob. Americans are free because the government is taking care of them. And you can see it, like, when they say the troops are protecting our freedoms, and let's pray for the troops because they're defending the freedoms we enjoy. In their mind, the mind of the statist, the mind of the liberal and the conservative, he's thinking we here in America are free because the government's providing for us. It's taking care of us with Social Security. It's requiring that we be good people by funding the Social Security system, the Medicare system, the Medicaid system, the farm subsidies, the aid to dictatorships, all the welfare state stuff. We are good people because the government requires us to give the money to the IRS, which then distributes it to the welfare agencies, which then distribute it out, grants for your community and all the rest of that welfare stuff. That to the statist is freedom. That to the libertarian is the absence of freedom. Now, notice that that's an enormous distinction here. Because you see, the statists would consider Americans are free because you've got this huge system of government regulation in the banks. And you've got, government FDIC, and you've got Social Security, and you got Medicare. All this means you are free. And by the way, that's also the concept of freedom in Europe. I mean, you go into Europe, anywhere in Europe, and you just take a poll and you say, do you consider yourself free? They will say, absolutely. You say, why do you consider yourself a free people? Because the government's taking care of us. That's what they're all writing about, protesting about in Greece, is the Greek, in their minds, the Greek citizen who's on the dole, government pensions, government Social Security, government welfare, government health care. In their mind, when the government's taking them off this dole, it's taking away their freedom. And so in their minds, they're over there protesting for their freedom. Well, how can it be freedom simply because you've got, the ability to take what doesn't belong to you? I mean, think about it. That's really what the welfare state's based on. It's how can one group of people take the money that another group of people have earned, right? I mean, it's really a war. I mean, we don't like to call it a war. I mean, you don't see the violence, but you have the threat of force with the IRS. If you don't pay your income taxes, we all know what happens. They will come and start seizing your property. They will sell it at foreclosure sale. They will evict you from your home. If you don't go, they will bring armed marshals and they will take you away. And if you resist, you know what's going to happen to you. So underlying the system is force. But the government's the middleman. You see, you've got this group of people that is saying, I want to take the money of that group of people. And so they use the IRS and the welfare agencies and so forth to take the money from that group of people and give it to this group of people. We see this kind of war waged between congressmen, where the congressmen, come back to their district and say, look at the federal money I have brought back to you. I'm an effective congressman, and the local media just eats this up. I mean, you have editorials saying, we've got such an effective congressman. He's bringing federal money back to our community. And then, then some people do analyses. They say, okay, how much do the people of this congressional district pay in income taxes? And then they compare that to how much federal aid has this congressman brought back to the district. and they compare it, and if it's on the plus side where he's brought more than what people had paid, man, the mainstream media just goes ballistic and says, oh man, this is great, this is fantastic, we have an effective congressman, he knows how to fight for us. This is inane for us libertarians. For one thing, the money does not come back to the people from whom it was taken in that congressional district. It's taken from them, and then the congressman brings it back and gives it to particular people. He gives it to the mayor or to the city council to build a community center or some other, football stadium, or some idiotic thing that they think of, a bridge or whatever. But notice that when the mainstream media goes gaga over this system, they're thinking, oh, well, this is an effective congressman because he's brought more back than what people have paid. But the people paying are not the ones that get their money back. But it is a war, because in another congressional district, it's going to be on the negative side. And that's where the mainstream media is going to say, golly, we don't have an effective congressman because he's not bringing back home the federal grants like their congressman is. And so every congressman's really waging war against every other congressman. In fact, the people of every congressional district are waging war against each other. Who can get more federal funds? Well, this is what they define as freedom, the status, liberals and conservatives. We libertarians say that's not freedom at all. Freedom is when everybody keeps his own money, no income tax, and decides what to do with it. Now, it might interest you to know that there was once a society that had no income tax. This is for those that would say, oh, that's impossible, Jacob. This is pie in the sky. That's not, feasible. Oh, okay. There was once a society that had no income tax. People kept everything they earned, okay? No Social Security, all right? I mean, there was no old age assistance. People handled their own retirement. For those that couldn't, they relied on the generosity of others, including their children. This society believed that charity should be entirely up to people on a voluntary basis. And so there was nothing mandated. There was a separation of government and charity. There wasn't this concept that, oh, well, government's got to take care of people because that will reflect that we, the people, are good. No, they felt the only thing that reflects that people are good is what they do with their own money on a voluntary basis, an individual basis. They want to donate to the church. They want to help somebody starving. That's up to them. But nobody was going to be forced to do this. No government involvement in healthcare. No Medicare, no Medicaid. There were no drug laws, putting people in jail for ingesting harmful substances. I mean, inane. Spending who knows how much money doing the same thing over and over and over again, destroying lives and just gaining largesse, asset forfeiture laws, bribes, crooked conduct, But anyway, this society had no drug laws. There were no economic regulations to speak of. I mean, there were a few that you could look to for exceptions here and there, but there were certainly no minimum wage laws. There were no price controls, and there were no immigration controls in this society. Imagine that. People from anywhere in the world could just flood those shores, and there was nothing the government could do about it. Now, of course, I'm describing the United States of America, and it wasn't like, our American ancestors couldn't have chosen these socialistic programs. They could have. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to, have the government take money from one person and give it to another person. It's just that that's what our American ancestors rejected. They didn't want that kind of system. They wanted a system where there was no income tax, no welfare, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid. And granted, okay, they had a horrific system. They had slavery. They had tariffs. They had lots of other exceptions, but they had no income tax. They had no Social Security, no Medicare, none of this welfare state junk. Now, imagine how depressed the statists must have been that were trying to get this wholesale new philosophy into play. I mean, they had to have been very depressed, like at the late 1800s, early 1900s, the progressives that were, they were importing these socialist ideas from Germany. I mean, this is where these ideas came from, this whole philosophy of the welfare state. It came from German socialists. And think how depressing it must have been to be a statist there, because Americans didn't want everything to do with it. Hey, this was a great system, no Social Security, no Medicare, no income tax. You keep everything you earn. I mean, and things were booming. You had a giant capital base. People, well, the best sign was everybody was fleeing Europe, the land of government security, government taking care of people, to come to the land where government didn't do that sort of thing. And of course, massive increase in the standard of living for the first time in history. Poor people were going from rags to riches. It was an incredible period of time, economically speaking. And so, the statists must have been depressed, but notice that they end up succeeding. And that was the big Roosevelt Revolution. Now we'd gotten hints of that direction with the 16th Amendment, with the Federal Reserve Act, 1913, where all of a sudden now you're talking about a central bank that can monetize debt, that can inflate and debase the currency. Oh, by the way, our ancestors also rejected paper money. I mean, they had gold and silver coins as their money. Another reason for the huge increase in the standard of living. Well, the Roosevelt Revolution comes along and everything just turns upside down. I mean, because you've got one economic crisis, they're able to seize on that, the status, and use that as a way to totally transform American life. And of course, they call it a reform. They've reformed free enterprise to save free enterprise. Nonsense. It was a wholesale revolution, a revolution in which the primary purpose of government became, in the United States, to take care of people. And so here we are now with this giant welfare state, crises everywhere. You see it in Social Security, when they say that, oh, it's busted, it's bankrupt. All that's saying is that there's not enough young people to plunder and loot so that old people can take their money, because there's no fund. Never has been a fund. They've always spent it as they got it, because it's always been a welfare program. Supreme Court's held that it's a welfare program. It's not a trust fund. It's not a retirement fund. Any money that you put in there is gone. Poof. And when they say, oh, well, is there enough money there? All they're talking about is, are there enough taxpayers working to help pay the taxes that will fund the dole recipients? Same thing with Medicare and Medicaid. Crisis after crisis after crisis. Even if the Supreme Court knocks out this mandate, what difference will it make? There's still a huge crisis. But you see, the statists, by convincing people, including many young people, that this is freedom, they obviously say, well, freedom has failed. Freedom is in crisis. The bailouts are a consequence of too much freedom. We've got to turn to government. Well, we libertarians know differently. We know that what has failed is statism, both liberal and conservative statism, because they're both committed to this welfare state way of life. We libertarians say it's time to reevaluate. And it's tempting to get depressed and everything, oh, well, do we have a chance to succeed? Of course we have a chance to succeed. If the statists who were depressed about their chances could achieve their statist revolution, we libertarians certainly can achieve our freedom revolution, especially now because we've got decades of experience of statism behind us. People can see the crises. They can see the bailouts in Spain and Greece and the system cracking over there, the welfare state system, the government take care of people system, and they can see the crises over here. And that's, in my opinion, this is why so many young people are now drawn to libertarianism, because they're seeing that when government's taking care of people, that's not genuine freedom at all. It's a fake form of freedom. It's the kind of freedom that you see in Cuba or North Korea and other socialist countries, where the government takes care of people and suppresses them and oppresses them and takes away their freedom. And the young people are recognizing that economic liberty is as important as intellectual liberty, as religious liberty, freedom of speech. And that what a person does with his money, what he does with his interests, with his talents, his abilities, is no different in principle than what a person reads and how a person worships and what a person speaks or writes about or reads about and so forth. No difference at all. So we libertarians, we have to keep going with what we're doing. We can't fall into this reform mindset, of liberals and conservatives. Like, well, which reform is going to be best for Social Security? Which reform is going to be best for public schooling? Another socialist program. Which reform is going to be best for, Medicare, IRAs, and so forth? Nonsense. We libertarians must keep trying to achieve our revolution, a peaceful revolution, a revolution of ideas, a revolution of freedom, where we separate government and the economy, government economic activity, the same way that our ancestors separated religion and the state, and separated intellectual activity in the state, and separated, speech and the state. That's what we need to do with economic liberty. Economic liberty is as important as all the other aspects of liberty. That's the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll see you next week, same time, same station. Good night.